From oil to rare earth to mining hardware, the raw material story behind crypto and digital asset infrastructure is a labyrinth of geopolitics, supply chain choke points, industrial policy and energy consumption. At its core is the question, who controls the inputs, the oil that powers the machines, the rare earths mined and processed, the hardware built and deployed, and how that control shapes the economics, ethics and stability of crypto mining and digital asset infrastructure. To unpack this, we need to move through several interlocking layers: fossil fuel dependence, the rare earth and critical metal supply chain, the hardware manufacturing ecosystem, and the geopolitical power games that govern access and control. Let's begin with the energy backbone, fossil fuels and oil. Much of crypto mining infrastructure depends on abundant, cheap electricity. At a macro scale, electricity generation around the world remains heavily tied to fossil fuel infrastructure, oil, natural gas, coal. In regions where electricity is cheap because of subsidized fossil fuel generation, miners cluster there. There's a direct line from oil and gas production, or their derivatives, through electricity supply to the hash rates securing blockchains. That line means that energy policy, oil-gas geopolitics, and regulatory regimes influence crypto mining, often invisibly. For example, when a country or region subsidizes power, sometimes via cheap natural gas or routine flaring of oil production, it can attract miners seeking to exploit low input cost, thereby shifting the balance of power in the digital asset world to that region. If that power supply is interrupted, whether by regulation, by fossil fuel price spikes, by local grid constraints or by climate policy, then the miners feel it directly. The upstream link, oil and gas, matters. Consider how refineries, pipelines and fuel markets are concentrated. A small number of countries produce a disproportionate share of crude oil, and similarly a small number of states are dominant in natural gas export, or in refining capacity. That concentration gives them leverage not only in traditional energy markets, but indirectly in power-intensive industries like crypto mining. If a country reduces flaring of associated gas, or changes subsidies, or shifts regulatory policy, then the cost of electricity in that region rises, and it may no longer be able to host large mining operations profitably. If regulators decide to divert electricity to other uses, for example prioritizing grid stability or renewables, mining operations can be squeezed. Thus, oil and gas politics become crypto mining politics by proxy. This leads directly into the rare earth and critical metals domain. Mining hardware, ASICs, GPUs, data center components, cooling systems, all require raw materials, copper, aluminum, steel, but importantly rare earth elements, REs, and other critical minerals used in magnets, electronics, semiconductors and power systems. The supply chains for these materials are deeply globalized but also subject to heavy geopolitical risk. For instance, the discipline of supply chain risk for critical metals outlines that disruptions may occur upstream, mining, midstream, refining/separation, or downstream, manufacturing/assembly, and that these disruptions can propagate horizontally and vertically across the chain. Frontiers, when applied to crypto mining hardware, it means that the miner's ability to purchase, maintain, and scale rigs depends not only on electricity cost and hash rate, but also on whether the raw materials and manufacturing lines are secure. More concretely, one of the most fraught choke points is rare earth elements, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and others used in high-strength magnets, power electronics, and advanced cooling systems. According to multiple recent analyses, China remains dominant in mining, processing and magnet manufacturing for REs. Estimates indicate that China controls around 70% of rare earth mining, 90% plus of separation and processing, and more than 90% of magnet manufacturing. Cheese.org. The implications for crypto mining hardware are profound. Even if a mining rig is assembled in the US, if critical components or materials originate in China, or pass through Chinese refining, then supply risks, export controls and tariffs become deeply relevant. Take for example the recent move by China's Ministry of Commerce, in 2025, to apply new export controls on rare earth magnets and materials, especially when products contain even trace amounts of Chinese origin rare earths or were produced using Chinese technology or processing. Cheese.org. The measure resembles the US's foreign direct product rule in the semiconductor domain and signals how China is weaponizing its rare earth dominance for leverage in global trade and technology. From the crypto mining perspective, this means that hardware manufacturers and mining operators must monitor not only their electricity cost, but also whether their supply chain is exempt from new export curbs, or whether they must source from secondary suppliers at higher cost or with longer lead times. Simultaneously, Western governments are reacting. The Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU, for example, aims to ensure that no single non-EU country produces more than 65% of the EU's annual consumption of a given strategic raw material by 2030. Wikipedia, that means mining, processing, refining and manufacturing capacity for critical minerals must shift or diversify, revealing that the hardware underpinning crypto mining is part of broader industrial policy and national security strategies. For blueprinting, this means any scaling of crypto infrastructure must assume raw materials risk, not just electricity cost or price of coins. Moving further down the chain, manufacturing of mining hardware itself is heavily concentrated, both in terms of geography and corporate players. For example, Bitmain Technologies Limited, based in China, remains the dominant designer and supplier of ASIC machines for Bitcoin mining. Wikipedia, many of these machines depend for their electronics and components on supply lines that cross several jurisdictions, rely on rare earth magnets, sophisticated software and cooling systems. The hardware thus inherits the supply chain risks of critical minerals as well as manufacturing geography risks. And when hardware supply is constrained, because of export restrictions, tariffs, shipping delays, or bulk demand from other industries, for example, artificial intelligence accelerators, mining operations face cost pressure, capacity delays or equipment scarcity. Importantly, the crypto mining operation doesn't just hop over hardware risk, the mining farms also require large-scale infrastructure, data centers, cooling, power substations, grid access, possibly on-site generation. The energy intensity of mining is non-trivial. In the U.S., estimates from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, indicate that electricity consumption by cryptocurrency mining operations may represent between 0.6% and 2.3% of U.S. electricity consumption. AU.gov, that dynamic ties mining operations directly into national energy grids, local utility regulation, and fossil fuel markets. Thus oil, gas and electricity markets affect mining profitability and location decisions. For example, if natural gas flaring is curtailed by regulation, or power subsidies are removed, or coal-fired generation is phased out, miners may find their preferred geographies no longer competitive. Now layer on the external factor of geopolitics. Countries that control raw material extraction, processing, and manufacturing hold enormous strategic leverage. China's dominance in rare earth mining and refining is a case in point. The fact that Beijing can apply export controls, delay licenses or shift policy creates an asymmetry in global supply chains. Financial Times, but it is not only China. Nations with oil/gas resources, or cheap power, or significant mining hardware manufacturing ecosystems, also exercise leverage, through subsidies, regulation, national security policy, trade partnerships, or through direct ownership of relevant firms. As the cryptocurrency mining industry matures, it inevitably enters the world of strategic raw materials, industrial policy, and national security. Let's follow a hypothetical scenario. A mining company sets up a large-scale Bitcoin farm in a region where electricity is cheap due to natural gas byproduct flaring being harnessed. It sources ASIC hardware built by a major manufacturer whose components include rare earth magnets from a processing plant in China. Now imagine China tightens export controls on magnets or rare earth inputs, causing a delay in delivery of new machines and replacement parts. At the same time, new environmental regulations curtail flaring or impose an emissions levy, raising the cost of the electricity that the farm relies on. Meanwhile, a rival jurisdiction introduces subsidies for miners running on renewables. The combined effect: hardware cost goes up, electricity cost goes up, margin shrinks, and the farm becomes less competitive, all because of upstream raw material and energy policy drivers that seem remote from the actual mining operation. That example illustrates the layered vulnerability of crypto mining to upstream raw material supply chain politics. In this context, mining hardware becomes a form of strategic asset, not just commodity. Operators need to plan not just for hash rate and electricity cost, but for supply chain resilience, guaranteed access to raw materials, rare earths, copper, aluminum, reliable manufacturing of ASICs, logistics of shipping and customs, and stable electricity regimes. Hardware risk and input material risk become part of the calculus of scaling up crypto mining operations. There is also a profound intersection between oil/energy politics and digital asset infrastructure. The more large-scale a mining operation becomes, the more it resembles an industrial plant or manufacturing facility rather than a hobbyist rig in a basement. These industrial-scale operations make demands on local power grids, transmission infrastructure, cooling, and often become subject to local regulation, taxes, and energy market dynamics. If a mining cluster is located in a region where electricity is derived from discounted or stranded resources, for example flare gas in oil basins, or hydropower during seasonal excess, then changes in that upstream resource, for example the oil field stops flaring, or the hydropower diversion is reallocated, can cascade down into mining economics. Thus, mining on stranded or surplus energy becomes a strategic play, but also a point of vulnerability via upstream resource policy. Digging deeper into the rare earth/critical mineral supply chain, research shows that beyond mining there are four broad risk categories: upstream, mine operations and raw material extraction; middle stream, separation/refining/processing; downstream, manufacturing/assembly of components; and general risks: geopolitical, environmental, regulatory. Frontiers: for crypto mining hardware and digital asset infrastructure, middle stream risk is particularly acute because even if ore is mined in one jurisdiction, processing often takes place elsewhere, sometimes where environmental regulation is laxer, or where labor costs are lower, or where processing plants have already been established historically. China, for example, has invested in separation and processing capacity for reasons on a scale far beyond what most other countries currently operate. That gives China latent leverage, even if another country mines rare earth ore, if it must send it to China for separation, then China retains control. Cheese.org. Therefore, hardware manufacturers that rely on these materials may face bottlenecks not at the mining stage, but at the refining stage, where capacity may be limited, regulatory scrutiny tighter, export licenses required, or geography politically risky. On top of that, manufacturing of mining hardware often demands highly specialized components, precision chips, heat sinks, cooling systems, magnets, power supply units, many of which depend on rare earth magnets or advanced materials. If a government imposes export constraints, raises tariffs, or restricts access to key technologies, the manufacturing of ASICs can be delayed, shipping costs increase, or manufacturers may be forced to seek alternate supplies at higher cost or lower quality. All of this reduces margins for miners and increases risk for expansion or upgrade cycles. In the broader power infrastructure layer, miners require reliable, high-throughput connections to the grid or dedicated generation. Some mining operators have turned to oil and gas producers' wasted or flared gas, turning a carbon liability into a potential revenue stream. But flaring and stranded gas regimes are themselves determined by energy market regulation, environmental policy, carbon pricing regimes, and the operations of oilfield companies. Therefore, the link between oil gas upstream operations and digital asset infrastructure is not just conceptual, it is operational. When a miner arranges a power purchase agreement, PPA, based on a hydrocarbon-derived electricity source, it is essentially negotiating with an upstream industry participant who controls the primary energy feedstock. Upstream actors, oil and gas producers, thus become indirect stakeholders in crypto mining. If they shift their strategies, for example, to sell gas into other markets, to shut flare gas projects due to ESG pressures, or to reallocate energy to hydrogen or other uses, then miners might lose their privileged power price. Politically, the supply of oil, gas and rare earths is often governed by state policy, national champions, export controls, resource nationalism, environmental regulation, foreign investment restrictions. Mining of rare earths is notoriously energy-intensive, often environmentally challenging, and frequently located in jurisdictions with weaker governance or geopolitical risk. For instance, building an independent supply chain outside China is constrained by high capital expenditure, technical expertise, environmental regulation and price volatility. TheOregonGroup.com. In the crypto mining context, this means that an operator considering a large-scale mining facility must assess not only local electricity cost and cooling but also upstream mineral supply hygiene. Is every component legally sourced? Are any raw material bottlenecks present? Could export controls shift overnight? Are there geopolitical risks in the supply chain of the hardware? Let's map some of the control dynamics. On the raw material side, countries with large oil/gas reserves, Russia, Saudi Arabia, US, Gulf states, have energy policy leverage. Countries with large rare earth or processing capacity, China, Australia, US, Canada, hold mineral policy leverage. On the manufacturing side, hardware producers, ASIC makers, GPU makers, hold technology policy leverage. For crypto mining to scale globally, a miner must secure access across these domains: cheap power, often from hydrocarbons, raw materials for hardware, manufacturing capacity, logistical supply lines, regulatory regimes that allow operations, including grid access, tax regimes, emissions regimes, and market access, for selling mined coins or providing hosting. Any weak link in that chain introduces systemic risk. One of the more visible geopolitical moves was when China introduced new export restrictions on rare earth magnets and materials in 2025, requiring foreign companies to obtain licenses if their products contained even trace amounts of Chinese origin rare earths or were produced using Chinese mining/processing technology. Financial Times. This is a demonstration of geopolitical leverage applied to technology supply chains, and by extension, to hardware supply chains for crypto mining. The upstream resource thus becomes an instrument of industrial policy and international bargaining. In practical terms, for crypto mining, hardware delays, cost inflation, lead time unpredictability become part of the risk budget. If a miner had budgeted purchasing a fleet of ASICs with a 6-month lead time, but rare earth export rules impose delays or incur premium pricing, the miner's ramp-up schedule shifts, affecting coin production forecasts and investment returns. Meanwhile, electricity price fluctuations driven by upstream energy commodity changes, oil/gas, or regulatory shifts can shift operating costs. Taken together, the raw material story is not peripheral, it is central. Moreover, the raw material politics intersect with environmental and ESG concerns. Mining rare earths, processing them and manufacturing hardware often produce hazardous waste, involve high energy consumption and face community/regulatory opposition. States may introduce stricter environmental regulation or export curbs to protect ecological interests or industrial policy. That in turn affects miners. The cost of hardware goes up, availability drops, supply chain transparency becomes more complex, and reputational risk arises, for example, hardware sourced from conflict minerals or from jurisdictions with weak environmental safeguards. In the crypto world, Already under scrutiny for energy use and environmental impact, raw material provenance and supply chain ethics may increasingly matter. Let's zoom out to consider how these raw material inputs feed into the broader digital asset infrastructure beyond just mining. Digital asset infrastructure includes not merely miners, but exchange data centers, hosting providers, cold storage solutions, and network services that rely on high-performance computing, robust power supplies, resilient cooling. All of these elements depend on metals, minerals, semiconductor fabrication, rare earth magnets, and energy supply. Therefore, the same raw material and energy geopolitical dynamic that applies to miners also applies to the broader ecosystem. As more institutions, regulators and governments become involved in digital assets, the scrutiny of input material control, supply chain transparency and geopolitical risk will increase. If we step back and consider the entire value chain from raw material to coin, it looks something like this: extraction of hydrocarbons or other energy feedstock, generation of electricity, mining operation, deployment, hardware manufacturing, which itself depends on rare earths, copper, aluminium, semiconductors, magnet materials, logistics and installation of mining farm, operational life cycle, maintenance, upgrade, power cost, cooling, regulatory compliance, coin production or hosting service, return to hardware suppliers, power suppliers, jurisdictions. At each node there are material, energy and political dependencies, and each node is vulnerable to supply chain disruption or policy change. What this means for crypto mining operations and digital asset infrastructure is that risk is multidimensional. It is not enough to secure cheap electricity and a supply of the latest ASICs. One must also consider, where did the magnets come from? Are the processing/refining plants in stable jurisdictions? Do manufacturing mines have alternate supply routes? Is the electricity source vulnerable to upstream energy market or regulatory shocks? Are there export controls or tariffs looming? Are hardware components subject to conflict minerals rules? Are local grid or environmental regulations about to change? Are the oil gas operators in the region under regulatory pressure? Viewed this way, you begin to see who is controlling the inputs. For hydrocarbon-derived electricity, oil and gas companies, regulatory authorities, and national governments exert significant control. For rare earths and critical minerals, mining companies, processing/refining jurisdictions, often China, technology suppliers, and governments with export control regimes hold control. For hardware manufacturing, manufacturers, ASIC, GPU, cooling system makers, and their supply chains hold control. And for electricity infrastructure, grid, generation, transmission, and hosting, utilities, local regulators and regional energy policy frameworks hold control. The convergence of these vectors means that crypto mining operations are tethered to a complex web of inputs controlled by many actors, not just miners and coin markets. Turning to strategy, for a miner or digital asset operator targeting growth, there are several lessons from the raw material story. First, diversify supply chains. Relying on a single country for rare earths or processing exposes you to export controls or disruptions. Building alternate supply routes, dual sourcing components, or maintaining hardware inventory can protect against that. Second, energy diversification is important. If your electricity supply is tied to a hydrocarbon flaring operation, understand the upstream risks, changes in regulation, carbon pricing, field closure. Consider renewables or hybrid power models where feasible. Third, transparency and traceability of hardware components may become a competitive advantage. As ESG and regulatory pressure increase, being able to show hardware provenance, conflict minerals compliance and responsible supply chain practices may matter not just ethically but commercially. Fourth, keep lead times and macro policy shifts on your radar. A sudden change in export policy, tariff regime, or mining law reform can cascade into your hardware pipeline or electricity cost. Planning for contingencies, having buffer inventory and flexibility helps. Fifth, understand the geopolitical overlay. If your hardware supplier is in a jurisdiction prone to trade friction, for example, China U.S., plan for alternate sourcing. If your electricity source is in a politically unstable region, build redundancies. In recent years we are seeing concrete moves that reflect this dynamic. For example, Western governments have begun ramping up support for domestic rare earth mining and processing, recognizing the strategic vulnerability of relying on China. Finance.yahoo.com, one article noted that rare earth mining is having a crypto moment because as digital asset infrastructure expands, so does demand for the minerals underpinning the hardware. Finance.yahoo.com, a resilient supply chain for raw materials becomes a strategic advantage in the digital asset era. In parallel, regulators are paying more attention to the energy consumption of crypto mining, for example the AI estimates on electricity usage noted above, which pushes miners to think about their upstream power source dependencies. And some miners are now wagering on stranded or flared hydrocarbon resources, or on co-locating with large industrial plants with surplus power, essentially building at the intersection of traditional energy economics and digital asset infrastructure. Another dimension, environmental and social governance, ESG, concerns. As pressure mounts on the energy transition, mining hardware and crypto mining operations will increasingly be part of the conversation. The fact that rare earth mining is energy intensive, often environmentally challenging, and that the cryptocurrency mining sector has faced criticism for its large energy footprint means the raw material story bears ethical and regulatory weight. Hardware manufacturers and mining operations that ignore supply chain traceability, environmental impact of rare earth extraction or the origin of their electricity may face regulatory or reputational risk. Thus, who controls the inputs doesn't just affect cost and availability, it may affect licensing, permitting, stakeholder goodwill and regulatory alignment. In sum, the raw material story behind crypto and digital asset infrastructure is as much about geopolitics, industrial policy and supply chain fragility as it is about coins and hashing power. The inputs, oil/gas for power, rare earths for hardware, manufacturing lines for machines, are controlled by a network of states, corporations and regulatory regimes. For anyone building or scaling a crypto mining operation or digital asset infrastructure project, these inputs must be mapped, controlled where possible, and hedged against the many upstream political and supply chain risks. What's often overlooked in the broader conversation around crypto and Web3 infrastructure is this: the digital is always dependent on the physical. For all the talk of decentralization, blockchains, and digital assets existing in the cloud, the infrastructure that supports it is rooted in geopolitics, mining, electricity, hardware, labor, and logistics. Every Bitcoin transaction, every NFT minted, every smart contract deployed depends, quite literally, on tons of mined rock, processed minerals, and millions of watts coursing through power stations, cooled data centers, and silicon wafers etched with nanoscopic circuitry. The illusion of dematerialization hides a deep material reality. And in this material reality, power, both electric and political, is wielded by those who control the ground-level inputs. This means countries, companies, and conglomerates with sway over mining, energy generation, chip manufacturing, and shipping. It's the very architecture of global capitalism meeting the utopian dreams of decentralization, and not always in harmony. As crypto attempts to disintermediate finance, create distributed consensus, and enable censorship resistance, it ironically becomes ever more dependent on centralized supply chains and raw material empires. Let's examine more closely who controls the raw materials themselves, not just from a technical or market perspective, but from a geopolitical and strategic one. In the world of rare earths, China is king. The country has spent decades quietly dominating every stage of the value chain, from raw ore extraction to chemical separation, magnet production, and final component integration. While the West shuttered its rare earth facilities due to environmental concerns and market pressures in the 1990s and early 2000s, China subsidized and scaled up. Today, the consequences are clear. Any disruption in Beijing's export policies can send ripples through every industry dependent on these materials, including crypto mining. And it's not just about the mining of rare earths like neodymium, terbium, or yttrium, it's about refining. Mining is messy, but refining is where the real bottleneck and power lies. You can dig up a mountain of rare earth ore, but unless you have the chemical expertise, facilities, and equipment to separate and purify it, the material remains useless. China's advantage is not just in the mines, it's in its vertically integrated control over the entire refining process. Countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, and Vietnam may hold rare earth deposits, but they still often depend on Chinese facilities for processing. This leads to a situation in which crypto mining, despite being branded as decentralized, is indirectly beholden to the political and economic decisions of a few centralized actors. If China restricts exports of rare earths or imposes technological export bans, as they've already done in 2023 and again in 2025, global supply chains are immediately impacted. And those impacts aren't theoretical. When China restricted exports of gallium and germanium, critical for semiconductors and high-end electronics, prices surged, production timelines slipped, and downstream industries were forced to reevaluate their sourcing strategies. For crypto miners who rely on ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, GPUs, graphics processing units, or other specialized hardware that depends on rare earth magnets, semiconductors, copper, or thermal materials, the fragility of these supply lines becomes an existential concern. It's not just about getting rigs, it's about getting the right materials at the right time, without excessive cost inflation or delivery delays. When chip production slows down, or when prices jump due to scarcity, miners either pay more, slashing profit margins, or face constraints in scaling. And it's not only rare earths. Consider copper, the metal of electrification. Copper is essential for wiring, circuitry, thermal transfer, and virtually every component in a mining rig, data center, or grid connection. With the push toward electrification in transportation, renewable energy, and urban infrastructure, demand for copper has soared. Yet the supply remains tight, with major producers like Chile and Peru facing strikes, water shortages, and regulatory challenges. Goldman Sachs famously called copper the new oil, and for good reason. As demand outpaces supply, prices spike, and crypto infrastructure builders must compete with electric vehicle makers, solar installers, and governments scrambling to update their grid. Who controls copper supply chains? A mix of multinational corporations, like Freeport MC Moran and Codelco, sovereign nations, particularly in Latin America, and increasingly, Chinese investors who have bought into mining operations around the globe. A similar story unfolds in cobalt, lithium, and nickel, materials critical for batteries, server storage, and thermal management. Congo holds over 70% of the world's cobalt reserves, but much of its output flows through Chinese refineries or ends up in Chinese-owned facilities. In effect, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has not only created trade routes and infrastructure deals, it cemented mineral access for decades to come. Chinese state-backed firms have acquired stakes in lithium mines in Chile, cobalt projects in the DRC, nickel facilities in Indonesia, and bauxite reserves in Guinea. That web of influence isn't just about making EV batteries, it touches the raw skeleton of digital infrastructure too. This raises a haunting question: if the hardware and materials behind crypto are produced, refined, or routed through centralized jurisdictions, how decentralized is the system really? Bitcoin may not have a CEO, but the rigs that mine it often owe their existence to factories and governments in a handful of nations. Ethereum may run on global nodes, but those nodes sit atop data centers running on copper wires, rare earth cooling systems, and semiconductors traced back to Chinese or US production lines. Let's zoom in on semiconductors, the brains behind all digital systems. The global chip war, led by tensions between the US and China, has become one of the defining industrial battles of the decade. The US controls key intellectual property and tooling required to make cutting-edge chips. Taiwan's TSMC produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix lead in memory. ASML in the Netherlands holds the monopoly on UV lithography machines. China, desperate to achieve chip independence, has poured hundreds of billions into domestic semiconductor development, but continues to face restrictions and export bans. For crypto miners, this matters. If the chips used in ASICs are delayed due to geopolitical tensions, embargoes, or IP restrictions, the entire mining supply chain is affected. For instance, in 2022 to 2024, the US imposed export restrictions on advanced chips and tooling to China, citing national security. This affected companies like Bitmain and Canaan, both major suppliers of ASIC miners, who faced challenges in sourcing high-end chips for their products. The result? Delays, price hikes, and second-hand hardware markets ballooning in size. More than that, Taiwan's geopolitical fragility, constantly under threat of Chinese invasion or coercion, introduces systemic risk. If TSMC production is disrupted, the entire global chip supply is thrown into chaos. Crypto miners are not immune. A disruption in chip fabrication means fewer miners on the market, higher prices, and longer wait times. The consequences ripple across every layer of digital asset infrastructure, from personal rigs to institutional farms. Now layer in shipping. During the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain bottlenecks revealed how fragile global trade logistics had become. Ports in Asia were congested. Shipping containers were misallocated. Prices soared. For crypto miners trying to import rigs, GPUs, cooling units, or transformers, the delays were months long. Even now, the shadow of logistics bottlenecks looms large. Any disruption, from war in the South China Sea, to labor strikes at Western ports, to cyber attacks on shipping networks, can delay hardware delivery or drive costs up 30 to 100%. Thus, the road from raw material to crypto hash power is perilous, long, and complex. It winds through mining towns, refineries, factories, ports, and political hot zones. Every link in the chain, be it a cobalt mine in Africa, a rare earth plant in Inner Mongolia, a semiconductor fab in Hsinchu, or a port in Long Beach, carries risk. To ignore this is to fall prey to a fatal illusion that digital freedom can exist without material security. But that's not the end of the story. Control over inputs doesn't just affect production, it also affects concentration. When hardware is expensive, hard to obtain, and restricted to only a few suppliers, the mining ecosystem becomes concentrated in the hands of those with capital, connections, and geopolitical leverage. Small-time miners are squeezed out. The dream of decentralized mining becomes a reality of industrial clusters in places like Texas, Kazakhstan, Siberia, or Sichuan, areas where electricity is cheap, land is plentiful, and regulators are, relatively, permissive. In Texas, for example, crypto miners have flocked to exploit the deregulated energy grid, tapping into natural gas, wind, and solar energy. In Kazakhstan, lax oversight and cheap coal power led to a mining boom post-2021. In Russia, stranded hydroelectric power from Soviet-era dams feeds massive mining farms. But each of these locations carries its own risks: political instability, grid unreliability, environmental backlash, or sanctions. Indeed, the 2022 Kazakhstan protests over fuel price hikes led to internet shutdowns that took down nearly 15% of the global Bitcoin hash rate. In Russia, sanctions post-Ukraine invasion complicated hardware imports and payments. In Texas, miners have faced criticism for exacerbating grid stress during heatwaves. So even when inputs seem abundant, context matters. This brings us to the larger philosophical implication: who controls the future of digital sovereignty? If control over rare earths, chips, and power is increasingly in the hands of states and corporations, can individuals and communities meaningfully participate in the crypto revolution? If raw material access is filtered through export licenses, embargoes, and carbon tariffs, can miners remain sovereign? What we are witnessing is the emergence of a new kind of battleground, one where digital freedom is negotiated through physical choke points. The miners, once seen as rogue operators with racks of GPUs in their basements, are now part of global industrial supply chains, subject to the same forces that shape trade, war, and resource scarcity. And the future will only complicate things further. As AI workloads, quantum computing, and edge processing rise, demand for chips and hardware will skyrocket. Crypto miners will find themselves in a bidding war not just with each other, but with Fortune 500s, intelligence agencies, and mega cloud providers. Energy demands will intensify. Environmental scrutiny will sharpen. Governments may impose taxes, permits, or carbon credits on mining operations. Activists may demand transparent mineral sourcing, fair labor standards, and green supply chains. Already, we see the outlines. In 2025, the European Union proposed a Digital Infrastructure Sustainability Act that would require large-scale data centers and mining farms to disclose carbon intensity, energy source, and supply chain ethics. In the US, the SEC has floated the idea of hardware ESG disclosures for publicly listed crypto firms. And in China, regulators are cracking down on wasteful mining operations in favor of AI and central bank digital currency, CBDC, projects. So where does this leave the average miner or crypto entrepreneur? It means adaptation is necessary. Understanding the raw material story, from oil and gas to rare earths and chips, is no longer optional. It's a strategic imperative. Whether you're investing in mining infrastructure, building a crypto-native business, or deploying a blockchain product, you need to map your upstream exposure. Who makes your machines? Where do the materials come from? What power grid do you rely on? What are the political winds in those regions? It also means alliances must evolve. Crypto cannot exist in isolation. To survive, it must forge ties with industries like clean energy, ethical mining, supply chain tracking, and even national security. The fusion of crypto and critical infrastructure may sound paradoxical, but it's already happening, and those who lean into it will shape the next chapter. In conclusion, the raw material story behind crypto and power is a sobering reminder that digital dreams rest on material realities. Oil, rare earths, copper, chips, shipping lanes, and power lines, these are the veins and arteries of the digital economy. And the people, countries, and corporations that control them are shaping the destiny of decentralization itself. The blockchain may be immutable, but the supply chain is not. To protect the promise of crypto, we must understand, navigate, and, where possible, reclaim the inputs that make it real.